Okay. So welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today for the webinar on Zoonoses, wildlife and humans in an era of climate change. I'm Alexandra Otis and I am the project officer at the Canadian Coalition for Global Health Research, who are hosting this webinar. I am so pleased you were able to join us for the start today. Just for some housekeeping items before we start, first I would ask you to keep your mics muted as long as you're not speaking, and we will have the presentation and then we will open for questions. You're welcome to put questions in the chat box, or you can raise your hand and we will open your mic from there. The presentation will be recorded and we will make that available to you on our YouTube channel afterwards. Enough for me now. Pavy, over to you.
Okay, so welcome everyone, and this video webinar is part of the regular climate change and health research monthly webinar series that are organized by the Working Group on Climate Change and Health. I'm a member of that, and the group was launched in early 2018 when we recognized the urgency of addressing challenges on the intersection of health and climate change. And our mandate is to sort of identify the knowledge gaps in the area, particularly among health researchers, and then communicate that and do knowledge translation to our organizational members, but also to people outside. So if anybody's interested in joining our working group, you let us know. There is a website on the CCGHR's website. So we have one page there. And today I'm so pleased to introduce Mira Ziolo, Dr. Mira Ziolo, and she's a clinical veterinarian, a wildlife human interface consultant, and she's a PhD candidate for the Interdisciplinary Studies graduate program at UBC. She's got a bachelor's degree in biomedical sciences at the University of Guelph in Ontario, and in that she did a mini thesis focused on a reproductive biology of tree kangaroos. I presume that was in Australia. After that, she gained her master's degree at the Ontario Veterinary College, which is also at the University of Guelph. For the past many years, she's worked as a vet in the UK, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and the past 10 years in Rwanda. She also spent some time in Borneo at the Knowledge Exchange in Health and in Harmony. But in general, the most interesting part here is Mira's interest that lie on building resilience and adaptability in health and wildlife human interfaces, and connect that connection of that to climate change. In that connection with wildlife and human interfaces, she's worked primarily in East Sub-Saharan Africa, and most recently in the mountain gorilla human interfaces in Rwanda. So she hopes to connect her work in Global South with this work we're doing also in Global North, and bridge inequity gaps. And what I find most interesting and for this part is that when she talks about inequity, she's talking about inequity improving multi-species equity. So she will talk about that more today, but it's really a whole reframing of inequity questions that we're used to thinking about. So most essential aspect for her perspective here is that this is really relevant to climate change and COVID pandemic. And so that's all for now. We take the questions. You can type the questions in the text box and we address them afterwards. So Mira, go ahead and take this floor. You need to unmute yourself though.
There we go. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay, thank you, Pivy. That was a very nice introduction. Thank you for that. And thank you all for having me here today. I will now start sharing my screen. So just let me know if this is working. You can see that?
We can, thank you.
Okay.
You just need to put it on the presentation mode and then everything's good.
Okay. Okay, so thank you all for having me here today. I hope you're staying safe and well during these challenging times. And I thank you for having me here today to share my perspectives with you. Before we start, I will respectfully acknowledge that I'm speaking with you today from Shawnigan Lake, BC, the traditional territories shared by the Cowichan, Sooke, and Malahat nations. I thank these nations and their ancestors for allowing me to thrive on their beautiful lands. So I'm a visual and experiential learner more than a logical learner, so my presentations tend to have a lot of slides and are rapid fire, but just please bear with me. It's more a message that I'm trying to convey with you today and a discussion I'd like to start. The main message being that the challenges that we're facing in health today are shared among all species alike. And are impacting our interrelated health. And I'm asking collectives of interdisciplinary health, such as global health, planetary health, and eco health, to expand consideration of equity to beyond just human contexts. So I'll start today with I'll start you off with a story, my story with climate change, move on to what is a wildlife-human interface and what's happening with them. I'll speak specifically to zoonoses and why we're seeing more spillover events lately. I'll share with you two stories, one in Rwanda and another one closer to home in North America. I will bring in climate change and zoonoses. I am not a climate change expert in any way, shape, or form, but I will. It is something that I know a bit about with the impact on zoonoses. And then I will finish off with a call to address the shared inequities in health. So just a story for my first experiences with climate change. I remember the first time I realized the profound impacts of climate change on our collective health, and that was in 2005. I was on the plains of a wildebeest migration route in Tanzania, where I was working with Maasai farmers who were grazing their livestock. I was learning about the erratic migration patterns that they were seeing, making life harder for them to know where to go with their cattle. Of course, the first thing, I know this is not a picture of wildebeest, it's zebra, but this is also where wildebeest come through. The first thing that I thought about was the exchange of diseases. Later on that week, I was on a bus heading out to the coast of Tanzania, and I saw this picture on the bottom left, a camel in Tanzania. When I asked the guy sitting beside me what a camel was doing in Tanzania, he responded, "Oh, those are Sudanese. They're bringing their camels down here to escape the droughts." And I asked, "Won't that conflict with the Maasai?" He said, "Yes, it's becoming a big problem." So this was my first experience with a climate change refugee. And this is when I realized, oh boy, this is climate change, and this is going to change everything. And that was when I was 25. And this last picture here on the bottom right is one that I took last year in March in Rwanda. The rains were so delayed by the time I saw this. If the rains did not come in the next week, the whole season of planting crops would be destroyed. People in rural communities were seeking out water in towns to ensure the security of their planting season. Thankfully, the next week rains came. So as Pivy said, a bit about me. I am, in true form, to a veterinarian, I'm more of a generalist who knows a little about a lot rather than a lot about a little. I'm a clinical veterinarian and I work in emergency medicine here on Vancouver Island, but I also enjoy working in remote regions with marginalized communities, and that's my bread and butter. But I'm also a wildlife human interface consultant. Currently, my work is focused through an interdisciplinary PhD with resilience and adaptability in health with wildlife and people who live at the margins. I work from frameworks of One Health, eco-health, and social ecological systems, but really I prefer to focus at the ground level. Contrary to popular belief, my work is actually more social than with animals. The biomedical side of things is actually quite easy. It's the social complexities that make it more challenging. So what is a wildlife-human interface? It is simply put, it's any zone of direct or indirect interaction with non-domesticated species. Direct could be an intimate reaction, indirect could be sharing space with wildlife, or wildlife interacting with domestic animals that then interact with us. They exist everywhere, these interfaces, in cities, in rural and semi-rural areas, and even in remote regions where humans are often seeking out frontier experiences or resources. And what's happening with our wildlife-human interfaces? Well, in layman's terms, they call it conflict. I prefer to think of it something more like negative relationships. As human populations are rising and habitats are dwindling, wildlife are coming in closer contact with humans, resulting in both direct and indirect consequences. Direct conflict, some examples, when animals and humans are physically interacting over resources and space. As wildlife are losing their habitats, they're coming into human populated regions attracted by human behaviors such as gardening and livestock rearing, searching for the resources that they have lost in the wild. Unfortunately, this is resulting in increasing devastating consequences and the loss of life shared among wildlife and humans and their domesticated species. Some indirect negative interactions that happen, there's so many that you could possibly think of, and probably more than what I'm saying here. I'm just pointing out two examples. A loss of biodiversity affects ecosystems, which affects humans and wildlife alike, and zoonotic diseases, so an area where my background in veterinary medicine has led me. So what are zoonoses and what's up with them lately? Well, simply put, zoonoses are any diseases that are transmitted from animals to humans. Today, over 60% of human infectious disease come from animals, and over 70% of those come from wildlife. Examples on the right here are listed. In red are the large pandemic diseases that everyone knows about. In yellow are the neglected diseases that are less obvious to more people. And I'd like to point out here that there is actually a larger proportion of neglected diseases or diseases that we don't hear about than there are pandemics. In fact, I think the stats are the WHO encounters 200 new emerging diseases every year these days. We just don't hear about them. So the USAID the first stage of the Emerging Pandemic Threats Program, where they were predicting where the next pandemic would arise, identified 4 main species that are the highest risk reservoirs for zoonoses. Bats, because of the viral load that they carry latent in their physiology, mostly only expressed when they are compromised. Rodents, mostly because of their close association with human activities and food. Non-human primates, due to their genetic proximity to humans and the ability for pathogen crossover. And migratory bird species, due to the large geographical ranges they cover and the ability for them to carry diseases with them to new locations. Transmission of zoonoses can be either direct or indirect through contact, ingestion, whether it's food-borne, waterborne, or fecal-oral routes, aerosol transmission, indirect versus inanimate fomites, and vectors, so insects such as ticks, mosquitoes, sandflies. And what's happening today with zoonoses? Epidemiologists are saying that we're in a third epidemiological transition where one of the biggest threats to global health is emerging and re-emerging diseases. Re-emerging infectious diseases are happening because pathogens are learning resistance patterns and learning how to mutate more quickly than ever. And many groups have put a lot of effort into mapping some of these areas where they're considered hotspots where emerging diseases are most likely to emerge, such as this one modeled by EcoHealth, the EcoHealth Alliance. This map, showing the hotspots in yellow, combines risk factors of deforestation or land use change in formerly forested areas, high level of wildlife biodiversity, dense human populations, especially where these are growing rapidly and where there are increasing interactions between humans and wildlife. And how did we get here? Well, there's a simple version and there's something that I'm gonna ask you to dig deeper a little bit. So this simple logic model says that as human populations have grown exponentially over the past 100 years, this growth has created much demand for resources, and natural environments are being cleared to make room for us. And to harvest food, energy, and to support our demands and make space for us, natural environments are destroying the homes of wildlife. Dwindling wildlife are becoming displaced and are coming in closer contact with humans than ever before. With this greater contact is a greater chance of spillover of diseases from animals to humans, which are on the rise. This is the simple logic model. However, there's more to this story. It's not just what is happening, it's how it's happening. It's not just that we harvest resources and alter our environments, we do so in a destructive and unsustainable way with the growing demand of resources. We are now employing intensive production practices that are stripping our environment. We have polluted, toxified, and shifted the climate through our short-sighted and selfish choices. Around the world, people are being displaced from their original lands in the name of development, many of which have a long generational history of living in a way that is harmonious with nature, that views humans and nature as equals in a symbiotic relationship. With the advent of development, such people are forced off their lands and forced to enter livelihoods that are unfamiliar with them. They take on habits and living in such ways that are in sync with the developments around them, but completely out of sync with their cultural traditions. And this represents cultural loss, which causes a deep sense of disconnection in ways of thinking, of traditional ways of thinking, drives up rates of mental health issues, resulting in addictions, poverty, sick environments, and creating a soupy and fertile environment for diseases to replicate and thrive. This is inequity, and this is what it looks like. It exists in our global south, but it also exists in our cities and in our own backyards. And where do wildlife fit in? Well, wildlife have also lost their lands. The air they breathe is also polluted. Their drinking water is also filled with toxins, and their lands have been destroyed. Their populations have been fragmented, and they've lost their traditional ways of living in a very short period of time and are just not able to adapt to the stressors that we place on them. So just as cultural loss creates stress and inequity in people, so does the loss of natural spaces and livelihoods for wildlife cause stress for animals. And just like us, when we get stressed, we get sick. Shockingly, so do animals. Like us, animals harbor many pathogens that often live in a healthy balance with them. They are exposed to many pathogens in their environments that are normally held in check by their robust immune systems when they are healthy. When they are healthy, their immune systems are strong enough to keep enough diseases at bay to sustain healthy populations. But when they are stressed in overcrowded and polluted spaces with the acute loss of livelihood, their immune system have undue pressures placed on them, and they're more likely to succumb to and shed diseases normally held in check. Now put stressed people and stressed animals in close proximity to each other, and you have a perfect storm for disease spillover. And this is where hotspots of disease emergence happen around the world, in marginalized communities where people that have been stressed and where animals have been stressed. So it's not just a spatial relationship between humans and wildlife that are increasing the rate we're seeing of spillover events. It's inequities and stresses that both humans and animal populations living at the margins are subject to, and this is creating an opportune time for novel pathogens to emerge. So let me move to a story, my first story, a place where I have worked and loved very much for the past 10 years in Rwanda. The Virungas Volcanoes and Bwindi National Parks is a transboundary UNESCO World Heritage Site, primarily in Congo, but small bits of it exist in Uganda and Rwanda. It's volcanic and a very rich and biodiverse rainforest, home to the enigmatic mountain gorilla, but also a host of many other species, one of the most biodiverse regions in the world. It is also a very important climate regulator and lungs for sub-Saharan Africa. The people who live here are diverse. Most of the people are local communities who live in very close proximity to the parks, but there is an influx of other demographics with interests in this transboundary park. Expat communities that are usually heavily involved with conservation, ecotourists, internally displaced peoples, militia, and rebels due to ongoing political insecurity, primarily out of Congo, but also in Rwanda and occasionally in Uganda. Livelihoods here are primarily dependent on subsistence farming and agriculture. However, gorilla ecotourism is the #1 income generator for Rwanda. It's risen so much that today, on average, in Rwanda, the average gorilla has 7 close human encounters per day, which is more than some people in the West here. They are also trying to diversify tourism with cultural tourism, mountain biking, and other adventure tourism and other wildlife viewing. But still, this forest, despite it being a UNESCO World Heritage Site, is being threatened by development, deforestation of its valuable lumber, mining, particularly coltan for the electronic industry and other such minerals, bushmeat and the wildlife trade, and most recently, oil exploration with an oil find in the park. So at the result, wildlife are losing their habitat and they are being displaced by people. They're getting increasingly habituated to people and crossing the national park boundaries into human areas that closely abut the parks. You can see this is a 4-foot wall that is intended to keep the park boundary, but animals have an easy time crossing. This is actually an integral part of the wall. Sometimes it's broken down quite a bit. They're going into fields and communities with no fear, crop raiding and destroying a whole year's worth of sustenance for a family in the space of a day sometimes. And unfortunately, this is rising tensions with locals for conservation initiatives and for wildlife, and they get killed with frequency. But what about another story around the Virungas? It's usually an overlooked story in this narrative. The marginalized populations of the Batwa Pygmies, also known as the Twa. These people are a Pygmy tribe that traditionally have lived within the forest and used practices that promoted the health of both their communities and nature as one. They are said to be one of the first Homo sapiens in the world. The forest was once their home, and they were guardians of the forest as its primary benefactors as well. They took care of the forest, all of the animals within, and the forest provided for them. But the Batwa see themselves as a colonialized people, first by agriculturalists and then by pastoralists in many areas, and finally by Europeans. And in some areas, the Batwa fiercely defended their ancestral forests against these encroachments of these invaders. But today, nearly all have seen their forests disappear and the rights for them to live within them denied. Although the Europeans have left, decolonization remains an issue for the Batwa, and they face extreme discrimination and marginalization. Today, they live on the fringes and have been displaced by conservation, ecotourism, research, and other international interests, living in small fringe settlements around the parks, often in destitute poverty, disconnected from their traditional practices. And with this cultural loss, they often find themselves driven to go into the park to search for resources they are familiar with, such as firewood and bushmeat. However, from an outsider's perspective, such behavior is criminalized both locally and internationally as bushmeat hunters and poachers, increasing the shame and frustration felt by these communities. And these are the communities where that are in closest contact with wildlife. Both here, social inequity meets stress wildlife and pathogen mixing occurs. It's here where we see a never-ending cycle of neglected tropical diseases and zoonotic spillovers that keep these marginalized populations, both human and animal, in poor health. How about another story closer to home, another hotspot for the spillover of diseases? It's widely spoken of, well, we all know that meat processing, industrialized meat production is a primary food source for the majority of Americans. And it's widely spoken that industrialized agriculture is a large driver of environmental degradation, climate change, and a hotspot for zoonotic disease spillover. As Michael McGregor puts it here, when we overcrowd animals by the thousands in cramped football-sized sheds, lie beak to beak, snout to snout, and there's stress crippling their immune systems. There's ammonia from decomposing waste burning their lungs, and there's a lack of fresh air and sunlight. Put all these factors together and you have a perfect storm environment for the emergence and spread of disease. And certainly annually in the US, there are different emergent strains of highly pathogenic influenzas originating from these facilities, in addition to many other pathogens such as MERS, hepatitis E, Rift Valley fever, Nipah virus, Campylobacter, Listeria, Yersinia, Salmonella, E. coli, and prion diseases such as Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease and BSE. And also these are facilities where that are a large contributor to many multi-drug resistant bacteria and parasites, which are another big One Health issue. And today, in the current crisis, these facilities are becoming one of the greatest hotspots in the US and possibly in Alberta. But this is not, as one medical doctor postulated, because of amplification pathways through livestock. There's no evidence of this. Instead, as a close friend and esteemed veterinary public health colleague and wildlife health professional described it to me, it's a human issue. As he's saying here, to look first, he would be looking first at the meatpacking, I'm just trying to move that. Meatpacking plants, like any other place where social distancing opportunities and personal hygiene are challenging to access. And I'd like to highlight this. Look at the demographics of the workforce. Too often, slaughterhouses workers come from populations with other social challenges that can influence their susceptibility. Ones that I've had the pleasure of working with have a high number of alcoholics, drug users, and poorly educated workers. And this really stuck with me because I've certainly seen this in quite a lot of other extractive industries. And when I looked into this further, indeed, post-traumatic stress is becoming more prominently talked about as a phenomenon in these facilities. The workers here in these facilities are some of the most marginalized and vulnerable of the demographics in North America, often immigrant workers with low wages for the brutal work they do and a variety of severe stresses daily, physical, mental, and emotional. And they are in close proximity to highly stressed animals. So again, another hotspot for a zoonotic disease emergence and a shared inequity issue. And then what about other extractive industries? perhaps people here and animals here are facing similar issues. So I'll move on now to talk a little bit about climate change and zoonoses. You might have seen the meme that speaks about the upcoming economic crisis, the bigger fish of the, and then the biggest looming fish of climate change. But when I saw this, my first thought was, COVID-19 is not the first and it's not the last. There are many more to come if we don't change, and climate change is a big underlying driver and among other interlinked factors. In the next few slides, I'll review some of the ways that we're seeing climate change accelerating the rates of zoonotic spillover. This topic is vast, so I will only be scratching the surface, but at least help provide a picture. I will classify 4 broad ways and then give you an overarching picture to give you an idea how climate change and zoonoses are interlinked. So the first way is possibly most obvious. Both chronic and cataclysmic climate events increase the rates of infectious diseases, such as rising temperature, increasing reproduction and distribution of vectors and pathogens, such as chikungunya, Zika, Lyme, leishmaniasis. Flooding is resulting in increased waterborne diseases such as crypto, Rift Valley fever, E. coli, and dengue. Drought and changing soil conditions can alter vector and pathogen survival, increasing them as well, such as anthrax and Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever. And erratic rainfall patterns increase pathogen reproduction as well in certain cases, such as malaria, such as we see malaria and yellow fever. A second way is with the loss of healthy habitats, there is a displacement of stressed wildlife, often to come in closer proximity to humans. So for example, here we're seeing bats and eaves of home and that carry a variety of viruses, coronaviruses, rabies. Raccoons carry distemper, Balis ascaris, roundworm, leptospirosis. Rodents are moving into homes, carrying with them hantavirus, leptospirosis, toxoplasmosis. Primates and croplands carry a variety of GI parasites, respiratory pathogens such as tuberculosis and human metapneumovirus. A third way is changing migration routes. With altering climates, traditional migration routes are becoming erratic, introducing stressed wildlife into new spaces and often intermingling with people. Recall the story of the wildebeest migration, crossing the Maasai grazing territories and spreading diseases such as tuberculosis and trypanosomiasis to both cattle and farmers. In Western Canada, toxoplasmosis is becoming a big issue, or has been a big issue, and it's usually cycled between cats and rodents. It's a tiny little protozoan that is being now found in migratory bird populations. And it's thought that these migratory birds could have introduced this zoonotic pathogen into beluga whales, among many other species that travel all the way up to the Arctic, killing previously naive wildlife and also affecting the Inuit food security as a parasite migrates to the brains of humans in addition to other organ systems. And a fourth way that I've just briefly given an overview of is pollution and toxin accumulation. So here is pictured a seal from a mass mortality event in Maine, 2018, similar to the event of seal death in the Baltic Seas of the 1980s. These seals have died from a canine distemper virus, but there's also a high concentrations of toxins accumulated in their bodies in both instances. Researchers believe that persistent organic pollutants such as PCBs, dioxins, and furans played an indirect role in these events. And certainly in 2000, by 2000, the world's chemical production had increased 400-fold since 1930s. I probably don't have to even tell you about that. Increasingly, there's concern about 3 types of chemicals that persist in the environment and accumulate in the bodies of wildlife and people, endocrine disruptors that interfere with hormones of both wildlife, animals, and people, and chemicals that cause cancer or damage DNA. In 2019, Linda Brinbaum of the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences states that the environmental pollutants are affecting how we humans are infected. But this also applies to animals. And we knew this. We've known this for a very long time. In 1979, it was said that the major effects of industrial air pollution on wildlife include direct mortality, debilitating industrial-related injury and disease, physiological stress, anemia, and bioaccumulation. Yet still in 2013, the empirical evidence is scarce, and much less the movement that we've done on this. So overall, we're experiencing a massive loss of biodiversity, which means that we will experience, and we are experiencing a loss of ecosystem resilience, loss of dilution. They call it zoonotic dilution because when you have more robust, larger populations that have a larger degree of herd immunity. Loss of dilution is as you get smaller and more densely packed populations of stressed animals. You're enabling pathogen replication here and thereby succumbing the population to disease. And this is leading to a very uncertain future of the impacts of diseases on both wildlife and humans. So with all that doom and gloom, I'll just pause here. I'm sure you've all seen tremendous positive effects on the environment with the international COVID lockdowns, and wildlife are also enjoying this moment from a small reduction in environmental harms. And in this pause, we have an opportunity to reflect and appreciate on our own skin these inequities and interlinked effects. Recognize how our healths are closely intertwined, both human and non-human. Just as climate change is taking a large toll on the poor and vulnerable people, and these impacts are largely caused by inequalities that increase the risk from climate hazards, non-human vulnerable populations are suffering just the same from the effects of climate change. And it's our shared health that is at risk. So in closing, I've been asking interdisciplinary approaches and communities of practice for health to reconsider modeling of how you approach health. Your principles in equity and health are invaluable to this discussion, and I ask you to extend this to other species, not by placing humans at the center, nor by categorizing humans and animals and plant life as distinct and separate, but by integrating the consideration of equity to extend to all species as we all face the same risks and uncertain futures with our interrelated health at stake. So, Hoichku, thank you.
Thank you, Mira. That was excellent. So we'd like to now, that was just phenomenal. We'd like to open the floor to people who are interested, who have any questions. To Mira, you should be able to unmute yourself if you have any questions.
Yes.
Deep silence. I wait for a second. I have a question, of course, but anybody in the audience? Okay, I get the conversation going because I thought, so I'm thinking of more from a social change perspective, because that's what really interests me, in that, what do you see as the greatest challenge that you've experienced as a barrier to that broader understanding of that I'm a biochemist, so for me it's all DNA coded stuff, so epigenetics or carcinogenic compounds or even microbiology, infections, it's all makes sense that we are interconnected. But what do you think is the greatest barrier for our understanding for this critical importance of multi-species equity, that we really need to change the way we look at the whole thing? And you can, what if there are any differences that you can see in your work in Rwanda and say here on Vancouver Island, where we think that we are so super environmentally friendly and all that sort of stuff, and equity is, we vote nicely to NDP and Greens, but do you see why are we not getting this?
Yeah, to be honest, the whole concept, the framing of it as multi-species equity is also relatively new to me. It's something that I came across about 8 months ago, and it just nicely seemed to frame what I was trying to convey through my PhD. It's a shared, I used to say it like, I'm a wildlife conservationist from a social angle, and I care about social equity and wildlife conservation, but it's really more than that. And I think it's a deep-rooted disconnect in our relationship with nature, in the Western relationship with nature, that goes back generations and generations and probably thousands of years. So just like generational trauma and disconnect from a cultural perspective, I think that I think this is a form of generational trauma that we probably don't even realize in actions that we do. So voting green, and it's a good first step, but that's not quite enough. And I'm not saying that it's going to happen in our lifetime. I think that it'll take generations, and hopefully we can speed that process up. But I think the most important thing is to be able to integrate consideration of this. A good first step would be to be able to have conversations about it comfortably. And the barriers that I've seen are people from the scientific and health communities and looking at it like it's not relevant for them. But it is, because it's values. It's what your foundation is. But unfortunately, the way it's been discussed has been through people like such as activist groups that might sometimes scream too loudly, for lack of better, or sort of just almost discredit the message by the way the message is delivered. So I think there's been a lot of walls that have been created. I've certainly experienced those walls even in clinical practice when working with rescue groups and SPCAs and rehabilitation groups. There's big barriers between the health profession and people who care with their hearts. And it's been just a deeply entrenched inability to communicate with each other, whether it's interdisciplinary or intersectoral. So I think it's going to require a lot of conversation and humility. And in terms of, do I see any differences? Probably, people, and this is, not evidence-based, but from my experiences, probably people who have a more recent colonial history are more connected, and we could potentially learn off of them.
Good, thanks. I can see there is, I'm just reading here comments, there is a lot of the Brazilian colleagues couldn't log in, so they'll get this, but that's an excellent presentation. There is a question from Vic, if you could tell, besides given these challenges, what have you been encouraged about it in the past year? So something positive here in all these discussions.
People are actually listening to it, you know, like you having me here, and people, like I gave a talk in my community in Shawnigan Lake a few months ago, and people actually listened and thought it was important. And that was inspiring to see, like there's a shift in people recognizing that we should maybe talk about this. And I think that's what it is. Like the other day, I was sitting with someone when I went to pick up my dog, and he is a hunter, and said some things that when we were talking briefly about, you know, some of the practices that he does, and I can't say that I was fully in full agreement of it, but then he asked me, you know, what am I doing, or what was I was preparing this presentation, and so I was kind of giving him a little bit of a lowdown on what it was about, and brought up multi-species equity. We actually had a conversation about it, and he didn't recoil, despite sort of his background. So that has been very inspirational. Maybe COVID is an opportunity where people's minds are becoming open to be able to talk about this, so long as the way it's talked about is not one that creates more communication barriers, but is more of a discourse. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay.
Thanks. I wanted to add, there's one more question. So Eugene is asking, saying thank you too. And as a question is, as economic forces along with politics is such a major driver, what policies or opportunities do you see as the low-hanging fruit? So what are some examples of successes that could be sought and achieved to give a sense of progress and hope?
For multi-species equity, or for?
I assume so.
Okay. Tough one. Policy, I don't know. I mean, I think that some of the calls for just recovery plans from COVID are an opportunity, especially over the past week, because there's been a global response to that. I think that's an opportunity to bring it into conversation and consideration. I think discussions around Indigenous people around the world, and empowerment of Indigenous people is important, and a crucial factor in this. I think that there's probably a lot we can learn from Indigenous communities around the world. So those are two ways that I think are low-hanging fruit currently.
Yeah, there is also a further question, like further to this, is that Nkied, and I'm sorry if I didn't say it right, I had a similar thought to Eugene, and her question is around what policies you think we can encourage that would look attractive to the larger public and politicians, attractive enough to get more people, enough people to support this type of policies that support the multi-species equity.
Can you repeat that question?
I think if you think about, I assume, this is now me interpreting the question, but it's like you showed the meat packing stuff and you talked about all these issues. So can you think about any kind of a specific policy that could encourage that and would look attractive and easy, so not so controversial to the larger public and politicians, so that they would get enough people behind it to support these policies? Because the policies are not developed unless you have a broad public acceptance.
Yeah, I think at this point in time, I mean, multi-species equity is not a campaign. It's not something that can change overnight. Like the inequities, it's a value system. So I don't think that it's something that you can change overnight. However, steps like that we can take in our immediate future are climate change related steps. So moving to local economies, localizing farming and food production, moving away from industrialized agriculture, making green choices. I think those are all steps where we're looking, where we're shifting our values a little bit, and we're looking at the greater good of community as opposed to just ourselves and what's easy and quick for ourselves. So policies that that support a green future and a green transition, I think, are a good first step. And then being able with that to integrate communication and just discourse around multi-species equity, because this is not something that is thought about up here and then is put down on people as a policy. It's more of a conversation that needs to be nurtured among people to enable a shift over. But certainly good first steps. I planted my first garden, my first food garden this year. I'm not a planter and I've been traveling too much. I'm not good with plants. I'm better with animals. But let me tell you, planting that food garden really was a grounding experience and sort of really creates that it's a value shift. And I think that would be a good first step. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I want to bring in, because the Corinne is bringing further, and you actually answered a little bit, but maybe you can think it from a different angle, is that she asks that, and how can we use this to advance the Sustainable Development Goals or leverage the Sustainable Development Goals for multi-species equity?
Mm-hmm.
So either how can multi-species equity conversations promote sustainability goals, or can sustainability development goals be used for multi-species equity promotion or to benefit it?
Mm-hmm. I do see a link between the Sustainable Development Goals and multi-species equity. And it's certainly a link that I would like to address. I just don't know exactly how yet. And I think because I think that the Sustainable Development Goals are a very useful framework and a good framework to work through and work off of, but I don't really quite know how that would integrate with multi-species equity quite yet. So
I wanted to actually throw there something that I thought when you were talking about the meat packing and poverty and people, marginalized people, having been an immigrant on a temporary visa in Canada at one point in time, and knowing that most, at least the meat packers in Alberta, a lot of them were Mexican temporary workers. So just to throw that in, that normally they have the most vulnerable of the most vulnerable. So there's a policy that could be changed, because when you are on a temporary visa, you're totally in the mercy of your employer. And so oftentimes you don't, if you are hourly pay, you don't even have sick leave, let alone any other benefits necessarily. But the point is that if you want to stay in Canada, you do not course any waves, and you probably cannot afford staying away from work, because otherwise you don't have an income enough to not only stay, but to send back home or take with you when you go back home, and you will not be invited again. So, and I know that in this particular pandemic case, they actually changed the rules, because they normally are not even covered by the public health services. So this case, they changed it so that they can get free healthcare. So it's that kind of human related policies can most likely, in this case, not necessarily the health equity piece for animals, but at the same time in this, just starting to think about differently of how is our food systems actually operating, and what allows it, how it enables spreading, because we ignore it. So that was just my little thought on there. But did you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that equitable working conditions are a good first step as well. And when I was reading about the meat packing in relation to a COVID hotspot, my thoughts immediately went to other extractive industries as well. I mean, I've personally witnessed people who have gone off to Fort Mac to get involved with the oil because of money, because of the expensive cost of living in British Columbia, and coming back has changed people, and it's tragic. And these are the ones who are wrecking, and I mean, these are the mercenaries essentially who are wrecking disaster on our environments and on our health, and becoming extremely unhealthy themselves within the process.
So I'm just seeing it's 11 o'clock, so I guess we close here. And I thank you so much for coming here. We don't have any further questions. I am downloading the comments for you just to make sure that you hear them too, because there are a lot of thank yous to you. And so I guess we close. This recording will be available, and Alexander will help with all the logistics and if people have questions. So thank you so much, Mira, and thanks for people to joining us today. So have a great day, and I hope you join us next time too.
Many thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.